Bienvenidos a un nuevo episodio del podcast Fe y Libertad. En el episodio de hoy discutiremos cómo las instituciones públicas y privadas pueden promover el florecimiento humano, ese desarrollo integral que permite construir sociedades libres, plenas y felices. Esta conversación se centrará sobre todo en los retos que estas instituciones enfrentan en países donde hay guerra y otros conflictos sociales. La invitada de hoy es Brick Murtzashvili, profesora asociada, directora y fundadora del Center for Governance and Markets en la Universidad de Pittsburgh. Jennifer es una prolífica escritora y académica, autora de 3 libros, entre ellos Land, the State and War, Property Institutions and Political Order in Afghanistan. Bienvenidos y esperemos que lo disfruten.
Thank you very much, Jen, for agreeing to do this interview. Today we will be talking about human flourishing. And so I wanted to ask you, how would you define the term?
That's a big question. I would just say it's the ability of each individual to live to their potential, right? And then as they define it. So to live out their goals and their dreams.
So it's an individual project.
Yes, I mean, but in concert with others, obviously. You know, we're social beings.
We're social.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how would you define civil society?
So I think this is where my perspective on this is a little different than most, because I think most of my friends who look at this understand civil society as sort of this space between state and society, right? These formal organizational structures and nonprofits and NGOs, whereas I see civil society as much more focused on the social side. And so civil society could be informal social organizations, even social norms are a big part of that. So civil society is much more encompassing. I have a much broader view of just the space between the individual and the state, right?
Yes.
Is our community governance, informal governance. And many people say, well, informal governance, that's like government. It's more like, looks like government, it's not civil society. But I think when these informal governance structures are created by communities and they are not recognized by the state, they much more resemble civil society than they do anything governmental.
Yes, I think here in Guatemala, people identify civil society with a certain ideology even or political bend, and only the NGOs and the organizations that fit into that category are civil society. And
That's
then everybody
correct.
else is not.
Right.
Whereas your view is a lot broader. Yes.
Right, not just these NGOs. And in fact, I think the NGOification of civil society has not always been the most healthy thing for civil society, because then these nonprofits, these NGOs become like governments.
Yes.
And they become dependent on donor funding, and they're no longer responsive to community needs, especially if the funding comes from external sources.
Right. It's
they're
sort of
more
a
beholden.
corporatist view of society, which is not healthy. Yes.
And they don't often have local roots, right? They're from the product of the intelligentsia, who's close to donors or government, and very far from the people. They're not grassroots.
So you clearly have been influenced by the Ostroms and the Bloomington School, which studied, I think, a lot of what you're mentioning now, common governance and common pool governance, and more of the informal ways that we can administer different resources. How did you come in contact with the Ostroms?
It's amazing. I did a PhD in political science, and I never read the Ostroms once in political science, despite the fact that she got her PhD, Eleanor Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom were political scientists. It wasn't until I did a master's degree in agricultural economics that I found her work through economists who were looking at her applications over natural resource management. And when they were looking at her work, it was very narrowly focused on natural resource management. on sustainable development, rather than seeing Ostrom's work on governance. And that's where I found her work to be so interesting. So it was, amazing that I was able to find her, but I didn't find her where I thought I should find her. And in fact, many political science programs even today do not teach the Ostroms. It's seen as this quirky economists don't teach her, and Vincent Ostrom's work very much. They're seen as very eccentric in economics, eccentric in political science. So what I've tried to do is extend the Ostrom's framework to more governance issues, not just governance of natural resources, but also look at very weakly institutionalized environments, especially societies that have been racked by conflict.
By conflict. Your work in Afghanistan and Uzbekistan is truly unique, I think, in that you focus on what is actually going on in the villages and in civil society as you define it, and in local communities. You describe Uzbek civil society as fragile, sort of operating in a legal gray zone. I think a lot of Guatemalans would identify with that, sort of tolerated by authorities, but nonetheless active and growing and providing vital services to community members. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I lived in Uzbekistan for 5 years. And at the time I lived there in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was one of the most authoritarian states in the world. It was like Syria, North Korea, very high levels of repression and social control. And the government actually tried to co-opt all social institutions in society, even like the traditional leaders. But what I found, despite this severe authoritarianism, was a robust civil society. So there would be the formal traditional leaders who were co-opted by the government, but then very quickly emerged an informal traditional civil society in the community. So people knew what they had to do for the external audience, for the government, but they still kept the informal traditions alive in their communities for life cycle events, for cleaning the streets, for things that had to be done within communities. And I was really inspired by what I saw, how people were doing so much under such difficult, threatening circumstances. And what happened was about 5 or 6 years ago, the very, very authoritarian leader who was president of that country for almost 30 years died suddenly. And he was replaced by a much more reform-minded leader who opened the space up, opened things up, but not so much. But what happened is when people understood that the leader is no longer going to enforce the rules, the formal rules didn't change. They just haven't been enforced.
Okay.
You saw a really robust civil society emerge. But I argue a lot with many international organizations, people monitoring and measuring democracy. They say, well, nothing has changed. We look at the formal rules, nothing has changed. I said, yes, it's still very difficult to register an independent organization. That has not changed. But what has changed is the government's willingness to tolerate more. And so if you just look at the formal rules, you see very little has changed. But you look at the informal rules, everything has changed. And it's been really exciting for me to go back after being not able to visit for many years because of the authoritarian nature of the government, and to see how people are doing things on their own. They're using the internet, they're using, Telegram bots, and they're organizing lots of things on their own and taking advantage of the space they have.
That's fascinating, really. How did you become interested in or aware of this phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, I studied Russian in university. And then because I spoke Russian, I joined the Peace Corps, the U.S. Peace Corps. And Uzbekistan, I was sent to Uzbekistan to serve as a Peace Corps volunteer. And it was part of the Soviet Union. Because I spoke Russian, they sent me there. And I lived in a community. And I was just so surprised because I had read the literature that said so much of traditional society had been wiped out by the Soviets. It had been decimated. And then I come to these communities and see it's very different from Russia, very different from other parts of the Soviet Union, and very robust. And I was really inspired by the creativity of people to overcome challenges. And so it was actually living in these communities myself for many years, not even as a student, just being part of a community where I learned. I taught in a community high school. And I saw, how teachers did things, how students did things, how people dealt with challenges. And I found it very inspiring. But it was never written down by scholars. And so I thought this was a really interesting opportunity just to look at this to help us reconceptualize how we think of the state and how we think of society.
I heard an interview you gave where you say nobody wanted to go to Uzbekistan, or like maybe it was a place that
nobody wanted to go.
Few people wanted.
We didn't hear about it.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, even it was closed off for so many years to outsiders. It was part of the Soviet Union. So even for an American or any really from the outside to go to the Soviet Union was hard. Central Asia was
almost dangerous.
Yes, impossible to reach. So little was known about it. And I think that's really changed. Now people do know, and there's a booming tourist industry there. It's really exciting to see.
That's great. Can you give us concrete examples of human flourishing through these voluntary private activities that you witnessed?
Sure. I mean, I'll give you a really good example from Afghanistan. There was massive corruption in the government. We all know that. It's been written about extensively. And I think one of the biggest examples of success, one of the few from Afghanistan, is in education. And so people look at the success, if you look at literacy rates. In fact, in Pittsburgh, I'm very active right now in trying to resettle Afghan scholars. We have almost a dozen scholars coming to Pittsburgh, and we're creating almost a mini university of Afghan scholars in exile because they can't work in Afghanistan right now. I've almost been laser focused on this for the past 6 months since the government collapsed. But when we look at the success of the educational sector, for example, when I started going to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago, this scholarly community didn't exist. And I have seen it grow. And Afghanistan actually had a lot of freedom of expression, freedom of association. And I saw the way Afghans took advantage of every opportunity they had to learn and to get educated. And in villages, there would be a lot of corruption in the education system. We see this all over the world. Afghanistan's not special. And people would be assigned a teacher or a school. This was all from the central government, but there was corruption. There was ghost teachers, people who were paid but never showed up to work. And what I found was that communities would just create their own schools. They would. I remember one village I went to, there was no girls' school. And so parents they collected money and they brought in a teacher from a neighboring village, and the teacher would come 3 days a week and they would teach the girls in the village. Now, not everybody was included, it's dependent on your ability to pay, but sometimes they would allow poorer families to participate. They realized it was a public good. And to me, this is a perfect example of the self-provision of education. If we look at the number of universities in Afghanistan, they skyrocketed over the past 20 years. And most of the universities that started were private universities. There were more private universities in Kabul than public. Now, not all of them were very good. There was various levels, but people were innovating. They were trying to succeed, whereas the government institutions were known as more corrupt, less flexible. So people preferred actually many of the private universities to the public ones. So people were willing to pay for education. They understood its value. And to me, whether it's at the village level or whether it's the national level with universities, you saw people really come together through their communities to organize education.
That's great, because you know that education is a big part of being able to advance and flourish. It multiplies your opportunities in a way. What role does religion play in human flourishing? Can you truly affirm that Christianity or Islam or atheism is more or less conducive to development and growth?
Well, so we typically think of like Islam and democracy, right? There's this big question about Islam and democracy and the relationship between them, and then the relationship between Islam and corruption or religion and poverty And we think of many Islamic societies as being ruled by strongmen and not necessarily by individuals. And so in this sense, religion, many people believe, undermines human flourishing, right? But I think a lot of this, if we look at natural resources, for example, many of the most despotic societies in the Muslim world have vast oil wealth. And it's that oil wealth that then really is what I think is the more important thing that undermines the flourishing, right? Because people may have resources, they may have money, but they don't flourish because they're not actively participating in governance and they're not actively participating in what their rulers are doing.
And so natural resource curse.
It is the curse. And so to me, the Middle East, for example, where people conflate the Middle East and democracy, I think what the biggest challenge is those countries that have vast natural resources. But I found, from the micro level, speaking at the micro level where I do most of my work, is that religion facilitates community, it facilitates prosperity, it creates norms of cooperation. So for example, give you a really good example, over the past 6 or 7 months since the collapse of the Afghan government, we saw complete collapse of all government institutions, including the central bank. And then the United States and the international community cut off the central bank, confiscated its assets, because all the assets were in New York. They were not about to give the Taliban access to like $7 billion of cash. So then how do you get money in and out of the country? Well, in Afghanistan, they have informal trade, informal finance networks that are all based on trust. And they're based on Islamic values. And it's called the Hawala system. And so using the Hawala system that's based on these communities of trust, you can transfer money from New York to Kabul almost instantaneously. And it's a very complicated informal network that people have established that facilitates money transfers. So now we're seeing international NGOs using Hawala systems to get money in and out of the government. Whereas during the state building period, this was seen as bad system. It was seen as an informal system that needed to be controlled and regulated by the state. And to me, that was a missed opportunity, right? Because they would see it as, oh, this is how drug money. Well, sure, drug money goes in and out, but so does every other kind of money. You can't just isolate the bad part from the good.
Academics tend to identify certain institutions as necessary for promoting human flourishing, sort of equal rights, openness, rule of law, respect for individual rights. And some of the countries that you study have very weak institutions, but nonetheless, you have witnessed human flourishing, sort of despite of these weak institutions. So how can we reconcile what you've seen on the ground with some of what these academics are saying?
Absolutely. So there's this mismatch, right, between sort of these micro level stories I'm telling you and the macro level outcomes. And why does that gap exist? And I think the challenge isn't, we tend to blame society. Like Afghan society isn't ready, they don't have individualistic values. Yes, they don't have individualistic values. But people understand corruption. People understand people understand what democracy is, and they understood that over the past 20 years, they were not given that. So this idea that, they couldn't handle it or was not appropriate is not true at all. They were never given it. So I think one of the challenges I see is this, when you see this gap between state and society, the approach that outsiders tend to use is to make society try to look more like the state. Social transformation is the key to prosperity. That's what the international state building efforts have done, is that you want to make everything Weberian, organized, rule of law, rational legal systems. And of course you need some of that. But what I would argue is we would go to a different model that would recognize the complexity of society, almost limit what the state does to a few key sectors where it can be very effective, and then let society take care of the rest. Because I think this would allow societies to create a virtuous cycle to overcome mistrust of government, if they're allowed to do things on their own, if the state trusts them, instead of looking at them with suspicion. And for most of modern Afghan history, for example, Uzbek history, Central Asian history, Iranian history, Middle East history, states have looked on society with great suspicion as backwards and incapable of development. And that's what I want people to change the way they think about this, is that society has lots of positive aspects, some negative aspects, but has to be given the right to develop.
And they have the resources, even in great hardship.
Absolutely.
To overcome some of the obstacles that they face. Yeah.
Exactly.
What are the essential institutions, in your view, that we need to center on in order to promote human flourishing?
Oh, this is a good one. I think it's constraints.
Constraints.
And I don't think people think of this enough.
No.
It has to be constraints. And that it's not just the capacity of institutions, it's the constraints on their authority.
Okay.
And without institutional constraints, so this is, people want, especially in post-conflict societies, there's this desire to move quickly, right? We have this brief period of time, we have to move fast, and that calls for great state capacity. And we move quickly, we win people's trust, we provide public goods, we'll transform society. When you put constraints on that power, you slow things down. But by slowing things down, you gain trust. And I think the constraints on authorities actually give people the right to speak up to them, to make their voices heard. And without this idea of state capacity, without constraints on it, we know anywhere is a recipe for disaster. But the constraints that anytime you're building public institutions, we have to think very carefully about the political economy, about the incentive structure, and putting in very strong constraints on rulers. And it's very counterintuitive because it's not the first thing that we think about. But I think without these kinds of constraints on authority, we run the risk of falling into the vicious cycle. And that is control, that is predation, especially when you have very weak institutions. It's very important that leaders try, to the extent that they can, to tie their own hands.
Well, thank you ever so much for that answer. I think that's something that we need to continue working on here at Instituto Fe y Libertad.
Yes.
Because we have, I don't think we've ever used that approach in our literature, so we'll definitely to explore that further. Thank you so much.
Yeah, excited to continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Gracias por acompañarnos en un nuevo episodio del podcast Fe y Libertad. Si quieres conocer más sobre el florecimiento humano o estás interesado en escribir sobre este tema, puedes leer la nueva convocatoria de la revista Fe y Libertad en revista.feylibertad.org. También te invitamos a escuchar el primer episodio que grabamos con Jennifer, titulado War and Development. Gracias por acompañarnos y nos vemos a la próxima.